Hello and welcome to another episode of Django Chat, a weekly podcast on the Django web framework. I'm Will Vincent, joined as always by Carlton Gibson. Hi, Carlton.
Hello, Will.
And this week we're going to talk about performance. So performance matters because it is the probably most important part of the user experience. Google punishes slow sites with SEO these days, and even something like Amazon with e-commerce has done studies showing that just a 100 millisecond slowdown can cost a percentage of sales. And what's 100 milliseconds? That's like a blink of an eye. As we get into it, what's the default these days for how was it 300 milliseconds? A user can't tell a difference, but then after that, every 100 milliseconds, I think.
Oh, well, I don't know, but there was something about iPhone back in the day when I was playing with those sorts of things. There was something about responsiveness. There was a 300 millisecond delay
300 is the one in my head.
Clicking in a web view, and it used to drive users mad. So people would be building native apps, but using web views, and there'd be this noticeable delay.
Yeah.
Versus a native button which just went off straight away. And I think the delay was 300 milliseconds, and there was some, can we get rid of it? No, we can't get rid of it because of this. But that
feels like a glitch in the system. Yeah, and it just gets super frustrating.
So I think 300 milliseconds definitely is noticeable.
Yes.
But I don't know why it isn't.
So we're going to go through, it's a whole set of tools and approaches. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, web performance metric was, they talked about less than 1 second screen to glass. Like if your full load time to interactive on the glass was less than a second, then users considered that fast. And that's like the gold standard. That's having your HTML delivered, your JavaScript on there, your CSS in place. So at least your first layout done, even if you're pulling in images and things like that, but also your page clickable. And the two glass is that it's responsive, that it's rendered and responsive in under a second. And that's considered like, that's quick. And you're talking about on mobile here.
Right. I mean, on a website, I say it's less, and I think over time people have come to expect better.
But that's I think that's pretty good. You bang that into, even say it's at your desktop, even with a decent connection, you put that into your desktop browser and you type any site that's loading any kind of JavaScript, and like half of them will be slower than a second. So anyway, that 1 second to glass idea is kind of like a benchmark. And if you think about how long it takes to load JavaScript and for it to, all the assets to arrive, you've got network latency, and then you've got the loading time, and then you've got the rendering time. It doesn't give your Django web application very much time to respond if you're going to meet that. Right,
exactly. And last point before we get into all this, I do want to mention Donald Knuth. Is that how you say his name?
Knuth. Yeah, says Wikipedia. I always thought it was Knuth. I was going Knuth for years, and then I looked it up. It's Knuth.
So Knuth, he's at Stanford. He looks at email, I think like once every 6 months, and thinks all these deep thoughts, and he has these incredible series on computer science. Anyways, here's his quote on performance before we get into it, which is, quote, "The real problem is that programmers have spent far too much time worrying about efficiency in the wrong places and at the wrong times. Premature optimization is the root of all evil, or at least most of it in programming." So you've probably heard the second half of that, but I think it's in context, it makes a lot of sense around as we get into all these things. Basically, think about what you're doing. Don't just blindly whack every performance efficiency mole that pops up, because those will be infinite.
But also, like, it turns out as a sort of matter of fact, just from how programs behave in the wild, that most of your performance issues will come from a very small number of places, and you won't be able to predict where they are in advance. So what you need to do is build it simply and as sanely as you can. Don't make optimizations.
Yes.
Just don't spend time optimizing it at all, and then profile it and see where the three performance bottlenecks, which are taking 70% of the time, are. Optimize those, and for a fraction of the effort of micro-optimizing everything as you went along, you've got a more performant web application.
Yes. But it is tempting to try to do it locally. So
yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Oh, okay, can I if I use exists versus count, do I get a 4 millisecond increase?
Yeah. Well, let's get into that. So how do you baby step up it? So the very first thing I would say is you have to have Django Debug Toolbar. That's a third-party package. Gives you configurable configurable panels so you can see the request response cycle of a page. Basically, it shows you how many queries are there and how long it takes to load locally. So this isn't a proxy for production, but it gives you a quick look at it. And the two big ones, again, do this in production. The two big things you're going to want to look at for queries is select related and prefetch related. Do you want to take a stab at those, Carlton?
Yeah. Okay. So there are, as well as Django Debug Toolbar, which you'd use locally, there are things called application APM. What does the P stand for? Application something monitoring. I can never remember
maybe?
the thing. Yeah, process. But let's pretend it's process. It might be something into it. It could be performance. But anyway, APM. So there used to be one called Opbeat, which got bought up by Elastic, and then there are other ones out there. What's the New Relic was for
New Relic,
a while.
Rollbar,
yeah.
is that one of those?
I always think Sentry should have one, but I don't think they do. I think they're
that's
just
error
reporting.
checking now. But I think Rollbar is Datadog, I think.
Right, okay. But anyway, there's loads of these, and they just wrap something around your application which monitors how long execution times take. And what you're going to find if you've got any old normal application is that your biggest hit is database.
Yes.
Is the time to fetch data from the database. That's most of your response time from your Django application. So what select related does is where there's a foreign key, you can say, hey, can we just join those two together with a SQL join, and can we get them all in one database hit rather than two or more? If it's
right, because one larger
one for each
database hit is
each for a related object. And then there's the other. So the other option is prefetch related, which is for many to many or many to one relationships, where you want to fetch, I don't know, all the authors and all the books, or I don't know, together. Can a book have? Yeah, a book could have many authors, so that's fine. And what that'll do is it'll fetch the authors, and then it'll fetch all the books that are related to the authors, and it'll do that in a couple of database queries rather than it can't do it in one because it can't do the join, but it will do it in two database queries rather than perhaps potentially hundreds.
And I think the history of Django, so select related was always there, and then I believe prefetch related was added later.
Yeah, I'd have to go and look, to be honest. But yeah, that sounds
so these are the two hammers that you're going to want to use as a first step, generally speaking, when you see a page that's loading slowly.
And Django's test suite has a really cool tool called CertainOn Queries, which if you write a unit test fetching the data you want,
I haven't used that.
You can assert that only one query was made when you use select related to fetch your data. And so you can kind of
something, Carlton. Sometimes look at that.
Well, I found it in the Django test suite. I'm like, what's that? That's quite exciting. But yeah, so you can write a unit test fetching your So say you've got a convenience method which wraps all the data you need for your view and returns it nicely. So you keep that logic out of the main line of the view. You can test that method use with a CertainOn Queries and say, look, I'm expecting this to make two queries because I'm using prefetch related. I want one for the authors and one for the books, and I don't want any more queries. Mm-hmm. So that when you iterate through your list in your test, it says, yeah, I did fetch all of the objects here in two queries, rather than one for the author and then one for each of the books as I traverse the relationship.
Right. Yeah, I like that. Huh. Okay, I'm gonna have to use that. So what else?
So reduce the number of queries, right? That's the first thing, and then make sure your queries are efficient. So that's the second thing I'd say is indexes. So
yes.
look at the queries you're making in your views, and then make sure that those you can use explain, the database explain. Query sets now from 2.2 have an explain method, which is kind of nice. It saves you having to extract the query from the query set using query.query, and then putting that into your shell to explain it. You can just call explain, and it'll send that off to the database and ask it to explain. It says what it's doing, and you have to do that a few times and read them. But it will say, look, and now I'm doing a row scan, and what a row scan means is I'm going through every single row of the database table to see what the matches are. And what you don't want that's where you want an index, because you want it to just go and look up in the index and get the matching values from the index, which is a much quicker operation.
Right.
So reduce the number of queries and make sure you're using index correctly. That's my big 1 and 2. And then you were just about to say
caching.
Yes.
Which we have a whole episode on this. And
yeah, we talked about that briefly before.
Yeah. So cache all the things.
But if it took a long time to get out of the database and you're getting it all the time, cache it. I worked on a site which was an API which was serving social media data. I don't know, it was a competitor to one of these. I can't even remember. It's so long ago. But anyway, it was social media data mining nonsense, and they had clients that were making lots and lots and lots of API requests all the time, and every request they had to check the API key. So you don't want to go fetching all the API keys from the database every single request just to check whether the API matched. So we would fetch it once an hour or whatever, and we would then check against the cache whether the API key was correct rather than against the database because, well, that's quicker.
Right. But the key thing is you're doing this on real live production data. Because again, I'll say this again to folks. Don't waste time doing this locally. It's so tempting to do.
But you need the code path has to be the same, right? So that Django gives you a dummy cache backend, which is great for local development because it exposes the cache, but it doesn't work. It doesn't do anything. So you can say, is this in the cache? No, it's not, because the dummy cache never caches anything, and then you can go and hit the database. So in development, even though you just use a dummy cache backend. It's a bit like using the console email backend,
Right. Yeah. Indexes, I want to quickly note. So, one thing which I think is cool is that starting with 111, you can do this in a meta class on your models instead of adding a DB index field. I personally find that doing it through meta is a little more readable, and it can put more things in there. But what would be... So indexes are abused. Like, what's the downside of just indexing everything, right? What
time and space. So it takes. So if you've got an indexed field, index field, it will column in the database table. It will take longer to write that record to the database if it has to index it at the same time. So that's time. So write performance is impaired if you've got an index in place, but also space, because it's like a phone book, right? So the classic example of an index is a phone book where I want to pick someone's phone number up by their name. Okay, so instead of going through the list one by one, I can just go to the alphabet, get to the right place in the alphabet, and get the number. But phone books are big and fat, right? They take up a lot of space on the coffee table in the hallway under the telephone. So that's the same problem for every index that you add.
Right, they're not costless.
Yeah, they're not costless. But to be honest, on balance, are you making actual queries on this data? If so, you probably want an index in play. But until you've started, before you build your application, you probably haven't designed it well enough to know which columns you'll actually be querying.
Right, I think that's the key thing is your schema can and will change, and especially once you start indexing schema 1.0, that's the wrong approach. I've done that. I
don't quite understand.
Like if you start with your basic schema, you go hog wild with indexes, and then you find out that I want to change change the schema around because my data is different, or I add new features. But then you've got the indexes, and it's too much. It's premature optimization.
Yeah, I mean, and this is this happens in NoSQL land quite a lot because, for instance, CouchDB, you have to create these views which are essentially indexes, and you have to specify them up front. And so you think, here's an index, I'll create this, or here's a view, I'll create this, and it goes and processes them all, and then you realize that was totally wrong. And this happens with Elasticsearch as well, because you think, I'm going to search on this, so you create an index, searching with these fields, and then you have to re-index it all, so you realize that isn't right. It's quite difficult.
This is the thing with NoSQL. It needs to be used appropriately, because when you first start using it, you're like, this is amazing. Like, I don't need to worry about anything.
Promised land, but
yeah. But
so anyway, use Django Debug Toolbar when you've got your application running. You're like, I'm going to deploy this. Okay, so go through, see what the actual queries are. Use the explain to. Are these queries sensible? Put an index in. Is it improved? And whilst local isn't a proxy for production, it kind of is in that it won't tell you the exact numbers, but it will tell you the relative scale.
Yeah, I mean, look at it for sure. Yeah, and we mentioned the other if there's a fourth big area, I would say be the front end assets, which as a Django developer you probably don't have as much control of. But you can use tools. For example, you can use Django compressor, third-party package,
super
which,
package.
Carlton maintains.
Well,
you want to use a
sort of
CDN. What you help with? You can use a CDN. There's a whole. Actually, I'll link to it. I don't know how to pronounce. Adi Osmani, who's at Google, has a whole free webbook on images, and which is really fascinating. I mean, for example, if you haven't thought about it, you can use Easy Thumbnails, which is a package, so that rather than showing the 2 megabyte version of, let's say it's a photo, a user profile photo, and someone can upload a photo, but when you show it on the screen, it's a tiny little thing. Well, you can have a thumbnail version of it, the full version of it. These are sort of basic steps that are really performant. So just front-end assets in general, and especially if you look at Google page speed, there's other ones all the major browsers have to evaluate site speed. They will help you, especially with the front-end assets, to see like your JavaScript is way too big, or you have
or is your web server configured to cache these, to send the right caching headers, to say, look, this CSS file, cache it indefinitely. And one thing that Django compressor will give you is a nice concatenated file, but it has a silly hash in the file name, so you can cache that forever, because if you change your CSS, that hash is different, and so the file name is different, and so you can configure your web server to tell the browsers and to tell the proxy caches out there, cache this forever.
Oh, it's fun to do performance stuff. It's just never ending. The last thing I would say, and you can say what you like, Carlton, is I find that the Django Extensions third-party package is very helpful because it's got a whole bunch of things, but specifically with Shell Plus, which will auto-load models into your shell when you need to drop in. It also has Run Server Plus. It's sort of a Swiss Army knife of tools. I find myself using it all the time because whenever I go into the shell, I want the models loaded, and it's just I can't live without Django Extensions.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of it. It's got this I can't remember the exact command, but it's got this ability to output a picture, a dot file, which is a graphics format of your models, and you can drag that into. You can either view that in what's the command line program? I can't remember, but I drag it into OmniGraffle. And then you've got a nice diagram of all your models and the relationships between them. And you're like, hey, I love that.
Oh, wow.
I can't remember what the command's called. But.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the hard thing with all these favorite packages and tips is just figuring out the priority and the curation of them. This is why, for example, Awesome Django is a repo I maintain. There's a whole bunch of third-party packages, and I appreciate lots of PRs and issues people put in there, but I don't want it to be 1,000 packages long. I'm trying to keep it curated. But when Carlton and I mentioned Django Debug Toolbar, Django Extensions, I would say almost every Django site should use those. Yeah, I don't have a problem saying that.
It's amongst the packages that I'd pip install without, really having any concerns.
Yeah, that actually that would be a cool thing to what's your top, your top 5, top 10 third-party must-haves if we surveyed some talking heads, and that might be a fun thing to do.
Yeah,
I should do that. Any last things on performance? We've really hit the kind of the high points, but
Django probably isn't your problem as long as you're not making 200 database requests on a single thing. If you do the basics, Django probably isn't your bottleneck for most web apps. It's your JavaScript and your front end stuff. That will have more of an effect. But if you're pushing it to to its, if your server is doing something intensive, if it's your Django application that's driving it, then select related, prefetch related, indexing, then caching. Things like serialization can cost time. REST framework. If you're using REST framework, if you're really pushing that to limit, serialization, it's like template rendering. It's an expensive process. So there are alternate serializing options which you might go for if you were really driving it. Make sure your middlewares are optimized.
We talked about that in the middleware episode.
But what did premature optimization is the root of all evil. Chances are you will get the throughput you need doing the 2 or 3 things which are eating all the time, rather than worrying about, should I spend a week changing my serializer layout to gain 5%?
Well, I was gonna say, 20% of the effort will get you 80% of the way there. But I feel like I've been saying this a lot recently, but it is so tempting to dive into these small little micro changes that will have an impact and ignore talking to users, changing more important things around. But it feels better to endlessly optimize performance. So I have to watch myself with that.
Well, it's like the equivalent of, some people, their busy work is answering email, right? For some
it is
I'm doing a performance optimization. Look, I've got 5% more throughput, but this thing is called once by a backend worker.
Right.
Totally pointless. Anyway.
Okay, that's the high points. As ever, we are at djangochat.com or chat Django on Twitter for the dyslexic folks out there. And we'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.